for the next hour, we're going to have the IPv6 panel on operational success stories. Should be interesting. I will have ARIN board member ARIN. I will have ARIN board member ARIN Hughes, who is moderating the panel, and it should be informative for everyone. So at this point, I'll turn it over to you, ARIN. Go ahead.
Thanks, John. Hi there. For those of you who don't know me, I'm ARIN Hughes. I'm the CEO of 6 Connect and an ARIN board member. And today we're here to talk about IPv6 success stories. I tried to get a diverse group of panelists that range from large ISPs, small ISPs, enterprise, software, CDN services, DDoS mitigation. So we've got quite a diverse crowd up here on the panel. To my left, we have Andrew Dull, who's the network architect at eGate Networks. Beyond Andrew, we have Dan Alexander, who's an engineer at Comcast. Then we have Rob Seastrom, who's the chief architect at Time Warner Cable. Oh, what are you? Principal engineer, my apologies. All right. He's got a promotion now. Who's behind you? Owen DeLong, we have, who's a senior network architect at Akamai. And on the other side of Scott, we've got Charles Gucker, who's a staff network engineer at vCloud Air VMware. So perhaps we could start off with just a little brief introduction on your approaches to adopting V6 and a little bit of information about your V6 infrastructure, respectively. We can start with you, Andrew.
Thanks, Aaron. I'm the network architect for eGate Networks right now, and helping them deploy V6 as well as continue operating the legacy V4 network. It's a smaller network headquartered in Toronto. It's a hybrid organization combining kind of a traditional internet service provider with hosting capabilities, voice services, as well as doing managed network services. We provide connections via DSL of various types of flavors, over cable, fiber LAN extensions, and also hosting in the Greater Toronto area. And throughout Canada through some third-party open access requirements that are allowing us to be able to provision DSL across almost all the provinces in Canada. For the IPv6 network, we're a fully dual stack environment, dual stack to upstream transit providers, and we also peer dual stack over Torrents. We're not currently using any V6 transition technologies. It's all dual stack. We manage our IPv4 pool very conservatively and take an active approach to recycling as kind of best as possible. We do use some RFC 1918 space for internal management networks and a few other areas. It's a fairly simple network, but we're able to provide dual stack services to pretty much all of our customers, including DSL, cable, and fiber services as well. Not all our customers are taking advantage of V6 services, but we're trying to introduce them to V6 as the opportunity presents itself. This is especially hard for our managed services enterprise customers who may not really understand V4 networking to start with, and V6 is just another thing for them to worry about. While we have the ability to provision V6 almost everywhere, there are still some places we have some growing to do. Network monitoring and management is still done primarily on the V4 network, and we still have some back-end systems that need to become V6 compatible. But I think one of the keys for success is having a good V6 addressing plan. It can make your deployments very simple. For example, we assign /48 to each site, and then on occasions we embed the VLAN number inside of our addressing blocks just so it's easy for people to find. So, thank you.
Hello, Dan Alexander. I'm an engineer at Comcast. We've been working on V6 for quite a few years, and we've actually gained a lot of momentum. About 25% of the traffic on our network is actually V6. We've got about 80% of our broadband customer base V6 enabled. We are operating in a native dual stack. We don't or have not deployed carrier-grade nets or large-scale transition technologies. We've tried to push native V6 to the customer wherever and however possible. It's taken quite a long time to get there, and there was a lot of hand-holding along the way with different projects. But we took a very very careful approach, kind of piggybacking on other projects, other people's momentum, where if we were deploying a service to do Wi-Fi or something else, we kind of took that soft approach of, well, can you just get us this one feature now, and can you get us this next feature in 6 months? And we've been fortunate enough where we started earlier enough and had the runway allowable, where we've now hit that kind of tipping point where our network is pretty much ready to go.
No, it's, there we go, okay. Hi, Rob Seastrom. I'm a principal engineer at Time Warner Cable. We've had native IPv6 in the core for many years. I want to say 2007, 2008 or something like that. But the edge and the regional networks are always where it gets interesting to roll out IPv6. Our strategy has been to dual stack CPE and devices in the field as a transition to running them in IPv6 only mode wherever possible. That's been a very interesting proposition to get across to the vendors that, well, this dual stack thing is nice, but what we're actually looking for is the ability to get rid of having to have IPv4 addresses out there. It isn't just we're running a second protocol because we like running two protocols, that we want the end state to be no v4 addresses in the field. So for things that are a self-contained environment, you're probably not aware of this, but your cable modem actually has multiple addresses associated with it, aside from the one that your router has, which is your high-speed data and customer premises equipment sort of address, which of course we want dual stacked so that you can talk to legacy IPv4 stuff as well as the grand future IPv6 stuff. There are some things that don't need to talk to the rest of the world, like the cable modem management address or the address for the phone line adapter in your cable modem. And in those cases, our strategy has been to move towards making those single stack IPv6. We did some work with the next generation set-top box where I was sadly not being able to, not able to claim that it was completely all IPv6 because there was still a management interface for it to interface with the legacy management systems in the field. But aside from that, all of it's talking to cloud services and things like that, single stack IPv6. We have a content distribution network for over-the-top video, which I'm pleased to say runs about 17% of its traffic as IPv6. When one particular vendor, who I'm not going to name, but has a lot of customer-owned and managed devices that like to talk to the network, fixes their IPv6, it's probably going to double. We're probably going to be approaching 35% IPv6 on the content distribution network for OTT video. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Owen DeLong. Akamai Technologies is a content delivery network, among other things, and so IPv6 has created some really interesting challenges and opportunities for us. We decided to prioritize things based on delivering maximum value to our customers, so our first priority was to make it possible for customers, even with IPv4 only origin servers, to present a dual stack ability to reach their content. We did that several years ago. We made it available to any customers that wanted it on an opt-in basis. We're now discussing the possibility of making that the default unless the customer opts out, and we're making progress on that. We've started trials on IPv6 origin fetch, which is being able to fetch the original content into the CDN from the customer's direct servers over IPv6. We've got a couple of large customers that are pushing us relatively hard on that because they want to turn off v4 on their origin servers as soon as they can and make v4 our problem and not theirs. And so we're making a lot of progress with that, and we're slowly starting to work V6 into our back-end systems and management systems so that we can hopefully someday turn off V4 for the most part. One of the very interesting capabilities, we're a DNS-based CDN rather than an Anycast-based CDN. And so we have to actually try and identify where the customer's coming from in order to map them to the best server set based on their DNS resolver address being a proxy for who they are, except in the cases where we get eDNS client subnet information, which is currently the exception rather than the rule. One nice thing about IPv6 is we can actually, instead of having to map an IP address to a particular location in V4 where we've got a limited number of addresses in each location, we can actually map a particular request or a particular resolver request to a unique address for each request, and then when we get the subsequent web request on the cluster, we can actually know, okay, that resolver was acting for this client, and we can actually start to build lists of clients that are associated with given resolvers in order to better tune and better optimize our service.
I'm Charles Gucker. I work for VMware, but more specifically the division of vCloud Air. We are the cloud services provider. Within VMware, the philosophy of software development has been focused around software abstraction and network abstraction. So with the IPv6 deployment, we do use it for an underlay within our backbone, but we have to start at the furthest underlay network and work our way up through all the different abstraction layers. That has proven to be a little frustrating at times because certain customers at certain points in the abstraction layer haven't expressed any interest in using V6, since a lot of our data centers are utilized as extensions or the ability to relocate workloads from their on-premise locations into the cloud. And those workloads don't have any dependencies on V6, since they're all classified from the enterprise side as just being internal workloads. So there's no residential exposure, there's no user exposure, there's no visibility outside of their little fiefdom. So it's a very interesting environment to be in.
Thanks for the introductions. So what about your approach to transparency versus active? Can you talk about your respective companies implementing V6? Have you informed your customers? Do you advertise that you're actually utilizing V6? Do you advertise that those features are available? Or are you more passive about it and just try and make the whole thing transparent so the customer never realizes that the transition's happened?
I think it's different for different customers, especially with enterprise customers. They're not, I think, wanting to have things turned on they don't know about. Residential type customers, it's much easier to turn on new services where they can just go ahead and use it. So that's a distinction I would make.
Has anybody taken an active approach to advertising to their customers that they're V6 enabled, V6 capable?
I'll see if I can speak to that. There are two customers. One is the people out in the wide world who are Time Warner Cable, high-speed data customers, business customers, that sort of thing. And of course, we have information about IPv6 on our web pages. But there's also a huge sales task, and it's a sales engineering task to the internal customer. The people who need to understand that there is this thing that will help them scale, will future-proof their internal product. You're building a web service thing that talks to this thing on people's phones, a thing in a set-top box. There's any number of things that you have a product owner internally. You have to go to talk to them and say, hi, I see you are thinking about doing this. You need to think about IPv6 for it, and talking to the data center teams, making IPv6 their default, not not an exception that they only do when people specifically ask for it. So I would say that it does not magically happen. That there's a sales component of this inside the organization as well as outside.
So at Akamai, we've done a number of different things relatively actively. We've had a lot of internal activism going out to the various software development departments saying, you know, if you're building code that doesn't support v6, you're hurting the company. And so we've had pretty good success with that. We've done a lot of outreach to our network partners where we've been deploying what we call AANPs or AANPIXs, where we push very hard to dual stack all of our connectivity on those, to the point that we've actually had some providers deploy v6 somewhat within their network just to get us off their backs. And then they discover, oh, well, that wasn't that hard and we can deploy it to our customers as well, which is kind of our goal in that. We've also worked very hard with our sales teams and our sales engineering teams to make sure that they understand v6 and that they're at least discussing that with the customers and customer prospects, trying to encourage them to dual stack their content on our platform.
From the engineering team, we try to do outreach to our sales folks. We try to find customers that are enterprise customers that utilize v6 to help prioritize further development up the stack for v6 availability. And it's frustrating sometimes because a lot of the customers are like, no, I want the really hot, sexy vMotion with HA functionality over v6 functionality. And a lot of the work that we do goes towards the base tenement of what we want to do in networking. And a lot of the customers, from my experience, are distracted by, well, I want the really pretty thing and not, well, what will make our lives a lot easier.
So some years ago when we started talking about deployment of v6 and really more specifically run out of v4, many benefits were mentioned around the space of, say, for example, longer-term planning, some automation ability, security ability, you know, the nice long address so you can play with numbers. I've heard some of you mention things like geolocation, VLAN identifiers, resolver locations. What kind of long-term benefits have you seen now having gone through implementations in terms of automation and scale as it relates to v6?
For Comcast, one of the key things was the management gains that were offered by going to v6. Rather than doing a lot of distributed systems or island deployments, to be able to deploy a single centralized management system and reach all devices on the network was a huge win for us. And years ago, we actually crossed a point where we have more devices that needed IP addresses than we had IP addresses. And we had to make that decision rather than to try and go out shopping and continue before. It was just much more realistic to migrate to v6. And we've actually reached the point where we have several million devices out there on the network who have never seen a v4 address. They've come up native v6 from the start and they don't have any v4 addresses.
Another message from Cable Land. We expend a huge amount of effort moving around IPv4 addresses from CMTS to CMTS. The delicate balancing, people move from here to here, you do a CMTS split, you have to rebalance, stuff like that. There is, by comparison, almost no activity going around, moving around IPv6 address blocks, because there is no extreme parsimonious mandate for conservation. You choose an appropriate size, you put it on the device, it's there for the life of the device.
So one of the things Akamai does is we provide a lot of SSL services. And it turns out that there are enough clients out there that still don't support SNI, that we have a lot of customers that want unique certificates. And when you contemplate that we've got thousands of nodes around the world, all serving thousands of SSL certificates, that adds up to quite a few IPv4 addresses around the world, and it's not a trivial problem. On the other hand, in V6, it's a no-brainer and it doesn't matter. It's easy to do. So we've got that gain. We're working towards realizing some gains in the management arena, but since we deprioritized the management software upgrades that are necessary in order to meet the customer-facing requirements, those aren't quite there yet. But overall, we expect to have a lot of benefits from V6, and including the ones I mentioned earlier.
When we went out and built our underlay infrastructure, the V6 allocations made it a lot easier for different locations and sites, and we were able to properly plan long-term. But from a software orchestration and management functionality where the individual cloud services customers would have their own multi-tenancy environment, our address policy has nothing to do with their environment. We don't present any routing functionality unless they're buying internet services.
I think it was Dan that mentioned back office as something that was a bit of a challenge. How have you respective organizations been with adapting tools, back office systems, sales systems, CRM, CRPs, billing systems, et cetera, to accommodate V6 transition?
I would say one of the benefits we had was a certain amount of scale that we could use to influence vendors, try and gain momentum there. Beyond that, it was always people often run into the issue here of it's always a matter of prioritization. Convincing a vendor that they need this feature on the roadmap delivered in this version of code, and then constantly fighting out over priorities versus what other customers may view as more beneficial feature sets. That's probably one of the biggest challenges that we always have encountered, is just the prioritization of code delivery. And then what seems, we often talk here, well, it would be so easy if we just did this. Well, sometimes that takes 9 versions of code in a year and a half to actually slip it into the roadmap. And that's one of the reasons why I've seen this stretch out is so much longer than it has.
I would say also that working with your vendors can be challenging because the level of familiarity with the protocol is much lower, and so you really have to be able to find the right engineers who know it, and in some cases there may actually be no one in the organization that knows it, and you have to spend lots of time debugging stuff yourself, which can be pretty frustrating, especially when your vendor isn't supporting the software that they built for you. But being able to have a success after going through the successful debugging and saying this is where the problem is, go and fix it, that can definitely feel like a good success story, and also trying to find the right priority to make that happen. So that's a challenge, but I think it's doable, and going through the process also hopefully brings the vendors a level of confidence with their code base up as well over time.
I echo those sentiments, and even internally within the same company, it can be extremely frustrating to get your own products to do what you need it to do.
Yeah, fair enough. So one of the things that I hear frequently when talking about V6 implementation, particularly with mixed sizes of companies and styles of companies, is Where do we find information on how we do things? What are the best current practices for doing these things? You know, how do I interact with vendors? Where do I start? If you had to give advice to this room about your experience on how to move forward with V6 adoption, maybe you could describe some of your takeaways from your experience on what worked well and what didn't.
I'll go first. I said earlier that it doesn't just happen. You need to put someone in charge of it. You need to have somebody own that process. My boss is Lee Howard, and that's he used to be on the ARIN board, and that's pretty much probably over half, maybe 75% of his deliverables for the year are focused around IPv6 adoption and curating information on it, managing, working with PMO on rollout of cable modem management, curating a collection of employees who are resource people for IPv6 issues. You sort of can't just hope that things organically happen. It needs to have somebody who owns the process.
So at Akamai, we have kind of the same situation. We've got a guy named Eric Nygren who is responsible for a lot of our V6 leadership throughout the company. We also have a lot of internal documentation that's been curated. In terms of public resources, the best public resources I can point you to are the ARIN wiki, getipv6.info. It's not particularly well curated, unfortunately, but it does have a lot of information if you can dig for it, and most of the information on there is at least reasonably good once you do find it. Another good resource is the O'Reilly books by Sylvia Hagen. She's written some excellent resources. Some of them are a little bit out of date at this point, but most of it is still reasonably good best practice. But your absolute best resource is finding the people that you know that have done it and asking them, because they're going to be able to tailor an answer to the way you ask your question and the environment that they know you're dealing with. You know, and every environment is different. So just like there weren't a lot of people there to tell you exactly how to do V4 when we first started doing V4, we're in that space now with V6. It's getting better as more people do more with it, but it's still the early days.
Microphone.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Sean Ojedeji, co-chair of ARIN Policy. Thank you for the share.
You need to speak very slowly and very clearly. Up here, the audio is a little hard with a fan behind us, so go very crisply.
All right, thank you. This is Sean Ojedeji. Is that loud enough? Thank you. Co-chair of AFNIC, Policy Development Working Group. I just wanted to get a view from each one of you. To what extent, okay, I recognize that most of you are probably not in the procurement department, but to what extent does your successes affect or require need for upgrade of device, that is the physical hardware? And I'd like to also know those hardwares that you then change, which are now at end of life. What do you do with them? Do you just ship them off to locations that still have V4? For instance, I come from Africa, and I think you wouldn't be helping V4 deployment if you're actually shipping those gears down to Africa, for instance. So do you have a policy on what to do with your gears or your hardware that are no longer, that are just V4 compatible, are no longer in use? Thank you.
So coming from a small organization, we don't have a formal policy on equipment that goes other places. I would say that even equipment that's 5 years old-ish, we're running dual stack on, and the code base is pretty good. There are some places where there's work needed, or certain parts of the network doesn't reach that far. But in general, we've squashed all of those at this point.
Sorry, I'm not familiar with our procedures as far as what we do with previous or decommissioned devices, so I can't really answer that question. I'm not sure.
I can't answer that question for my day job, but I can answer that question for my avocation. I run a small friends and family colo, and we have the luxury of being able to say, yeah, we're not keeping anything around that doesn't do IPv6, but part of that is, well, it's twofold. One is we don't have that much equipment to begin with, so the total cost of upgrading everything is not likely to be prohibitive. But another prong of that is that we leverage some very low-cost technologies that people who do rural networking are very familiar with, vendors who offer sub $100 routers and switches and stuff, and use those when appropriate. It comes with its own set of support issues, of course. It's not coming from Fortune 500 vendors. At the same time, there's a cost-benefit trade-off to that, and we actually find, because of the nature of our friends and family customer base, which you can imagine are people in this room kind of people, that they value IPv6 very much, and it would not do to offer my friends IPv4 only internet.
Yeah, I think that.
So in our case, at Akamai, I don't know what we do with used equipment. I have no idea. But I do know that we haven't really had to replace any equipment just for the sake of V6. Everything we've been buying for many, many years now has been V6 capable. And we tend to upgrade technology out of necessity for performance and other things on about a 2 to 3 year basis. So it's actually been pretty hard in the last 2 to 3 years to buy large-scale equipment, equipment that operates at the scale we do, that doesn't support V6, even if you went hunting for it. And we don't look for that. We look for equipment that's dual stack.
Next question.
Chris Whitfield with Twitter. Just one additional comment to the last question. Often what I find has happened is it's not so much that there is hardware that simply doesn't support V6, but there's a lot of hardware, I'm not going to name names, that where the software support for a particular model has been end-of-lifed, but with critical bugs unresolved that makes V6 impractical to use on that hardware, at least in my environment. I've run into that one a couple times.
Thanks, Chris.
I think the other side of that question was very important too, as far as when providers or network operators are acquiring gear. It's very important to get in front of the people that are making those purchasing decisions, and that was considerable challenge for us when getting the V6 requirement into those purchasing decisions. So gear wasn't coming onto the network. That was then you've committed yourself to a whole life cycle where you now have to wait 3-5+ years before you can get that gear back out of the network. I think a big piece of that was actually getting in front of the procurement people.
Mr. Lee.
Hi, Louis Lee, Google Fiber. So for me, each of you, when do you consider IPv4 to be no longer relevant to you, or maybe to the rest of the net? Right now, the Alexa's top 1,000 websites list says 18% are v6 reachable. I don't know how to categorize as the top 1,000 websites, and your enterprise might not care about the top 1,000 if they can't reach, say, PeopleSoft, right? Their HR or Salesforce. So how do you deal with that? And I think with Comcast, there are some v6 only customers already, so maybe it's not relevant to you anymore for v4. What are your thoughts on that? Maybe for not just Comcast, but others too.
I guess I'll start. You called me out. I can't really speak to, long-range service or business plans. Speaking, personally, I've been saying for several years, I always thought that tipping point was actually going to be reached the end of last year. So I was definitely off, there when I was saying it 5 years ago. So I was a little off in my projections, but I see that tipping point of where most, general internet users could get to the sites that they want to natively over v6 only. I see that coming a lot sooner than, some people may feel. I would like to see it happen, this year, but I can't really project that.
It depends a lot on the class of customer. I'm going to use my little sister as an example. She's a paralegal. So the amount of stuff that she does on the internet is constrained a little bit compared to what we would do. I think with one exception, and of course I'm not going to name names in keeping with our tradition here, but if you look at the Alexa top 10 or top 15, you can sort of figure that she would be pretty happy and might not notice if IPv6 was the only protocol and IPv4 went away completely, with the exception of maybe one or two sites. So the tipping point is incredibly close for a certain class of user. That's not going to get us over the hump where we don't have to have it out there at all, because of course, like when we talk about cable modem management, the magic time when we can get rid of IPv4 scopes on the CMTS is not when we get most of the cable modems over onto v6 management. It's when we get the last cable modem over onto v6 management.
So I think there's multiple levels of IPv4 no longer relevant. I think the first group where IPv4 is going to become no longer sufficiently relevant that they want to pay what it's going to cost is going to be the residential end user. And I think that that's going to happen probably in the next 4 to 9 years. Last year I was saying 5 to 10. I think we're still on track for that. I don't think it's going to happen because they're just no longer going to care about v4 so much as the providers that provide their service recognize the ever-increasing cost of maintaining carrier-grade NAT gateways and maintaining other various hacks to allow them to continue to provide some form of v4 service to these people. They're going to have to start charging a premium for that service. And I think at the point that v4 costs more and more people are going to be willing to give up the fewer and fewer sites that don't support it. So I think that's where that tipping point is going to start. And then of course, once a high enough percentage of the customers are no longer using v4 anyway because they don't want to pay extra for it, then the content providers will start to say, well, why are we maintaining this at this point? Nobody cares about it. So I think overall, end to end, that process may take about 15 to 20 years. But I think that within the next 4 to 9 years, we will see the point where residential users start abandoning v4 at a relatively high rate of speed as it starts to cost more.
And I agree with Owen that the price of the public internet connectivity will drive the adoption of v6 over v4, but internally, privately within an enterprise, you have a much longer runway because they have to move all of their services off, and they're historically, and I'm going to make a very big generalization, enterprise customers don't like to change for the sake of change. They will stay with what works until it breaks. So until it breaks, they're not going to look at changing.
Yeah, I'll just concur with that at the very end, that small enterprises and very large enterprises, I think, are very slow in adopting V6 and may still not even be on their radar. And trying to get exposure to that, it's just something that the network works fine now. Why do I want to do something new and different and manage? Oh wait, I have to manage 2 sets of firewall rules instead of just one. They're not there yet for sure, and I don't see them getting there, anytime soon until I think everybody realizes that their phone does V6 only and it talks to everything V6 only. Then I think people will wake up and go, oh, maybe I do need to jump on this bandwagon and move my organization forward.
Kevin Bloomberg, The Wire, ARIN AC.
Closer.
Better. So at sort of the high view, the 30,000-foot view, I've got sort of 2 soundbite views of what I'm hearing here. One is there's a business advantage for our organization to deploy IPv6. Whether or not customers see the need today, we see the need, therefore we are deploying V6. And then on the flip side, what I hear is we are a large organization. To be able to scale our organization moving forward, V6 makes sense for the size of our organization. What I'm not hearing is because of the next great thing, our customers are demanding IPv6. And I guess 5 years ago, we were all waiting for that app, the killer app that was going to use IPv6. IoT's sort of been talked about this year as being that next big thing. But it's, other than the slow progression of deployment for scalability or for business objectives, do any of you see a push from consumers or from the public for IPv6 in the next 24 to 36 months?
I think I'll just answer that. No, I don't see the killer app on the horizon right now. I think there's possibility that it still could come around, but I don't see that right now.
I don't necessarily think a killer app is coming, but I do feel that this tipping point will be reached where enough networks are V6 enabled, where whoever is not will start playing a game of catch up, or they'll have to catch up if they want to keep up kind of scenario.
I believe that our customers are principally interested in cat videos and social networking, and they want it fast and they want it cheap. So they want IPv6, they just don't know that they want IPv6 because they don't care what protocol it's delivered over so long as it is good, fast, and cheap. And yes, they do want all 3.
There are still people that drive Model Ts. Not very many of them, but there are some out there. So it will be with V4 in the future. There will still be some people clinging with their broken fingernails to the last vestiges of the V4 internet for a very long time. But just as you periodically replace your car because it starts to get too expensive to maintain the old one, people are going to slowly be developing ways to put V6 in their network instead of V4 because it's getting more and more expensive to keep V4 running. The large providers and the large organizations are feeling that pain earlier than the small consumers of V4, but there comes a point where as more and more stuff is available on V6 and less consumers are able to support V4 or are less and less willing to pay for the added cost of staying on V4, V6 will become more and more dominant. That's the closest thing we have to a killer application, is the continued existence of an internet that everybody fits on. They don't all fit today. Roughly 1/3 of the world's population still isn't on the internet yet, and there's no place to add them in the V4 space. So we're going to have to do something different, and over the next few years, I think that it's pretty clear there aren't enough different things we can do to juggle V4 and try and keep all the balls in the air. and it just gets too expensive to do that. So I think that's as close as we come to a killer app. But on the other hand, there are lots of car companies still selling new cars, so maybe that model works over time.
And I echo a lot of what the panel said. Absent of these communities and internationally, most of the general internet users don't care if it's v4 or v6. All they care is, does this page load? Can I send my email? That's it. Anything past that, they could not care less.
Thank you.
So perhaps along those lines, we can talk about successes a little bit. I certainly heard management's easier, scale's easier, locations resolvers, geoinformation, the long addressing gives you some unique identifiers to play with. Have there been any other kinds of significant gains because of deploying v6? An example might be deployment of set-top boxes, or anything that you've seen that's interesting for your own respective organizations that v6 has made easier.
For one, for a backbone, it let me do a greenfield deployment and not have to deal with a lot of cruft that pre-existed.
One thing I've noticed is just simple operational ease in a sense. While a v6 address is much harder to recognize or to remember versus a v4 address, the fact that a lot of whether it's security or routing or different groups, when we're micromanaging a v4 address and you have an ACL that's 50 lines long versus you plop one prefix in that v6 filter, and it quickly becomes a lot more recognizable, and the v4 recognizability becomes irrelevant.
Most people who haven't worked at a really big company are unaware of just quite how easy it is to run out of Net 10. And when you run out of Net 10, you start doing really bad things like regionalizing your network and breaking the end-to-end principle. I see Vit nodding down there. And it becomes very painful to do that. And we're actually collapsing back some management functionality to things, because you don't have to go through the scary proxy that you skip a request to query a cable modem through this thing that lives in the region where it talks to. It all just sort of works.
Rather than express this in terms of additional benefits to v6, I'm going to kind of flip it around. Day to day, I spend my day working on a lot of things that are dual stacked. I spend the majority of my time dealing with problems that are unique to v4. v6 just keeps working. It doesn't run out of addresses. It doesn't run into scaling problems. It doesn't require me to readdress an exchange point because they went from a 24 to a 22 because they ran out of numbers for new members of the exchange, or renumbering the small island exchange point from a 28 to a 24, or any of those sorts of things that are all common occurrences in my day. v6 doesn't have any of those problems. On the few occasions when I'm working on a v6 problem, it's actually something interesting, something unique, something new. Whereas with v4, there's just this day-to-day drudgery of scaling problems, and it's, the song is still the same. It's the same thing over and over again of just v4 doesn't scale, and how did we fail to scale it today? So there are so many drawbacks to v4 that tend to get ignored because we just take them for granted, but those drawbacks aren't there in v6, and getting away from those drawbacks is worthwhile.
One operational thing that I noticed is that when technicians go out and service equipment, they want to get into the management IP. When you're in a v6 only environment, they have to rely on DNS. They can't just remember 192.168 and blur out the IP. That may or may not still be the same device. So from a scale perspective, if they're forced to use DNS, it makes a consistency event much, much easier, because now you know your management station's given the same address as your technicians, as everyone else along the line, you're referring to the same thing and not what someone believes something once was.
I just say the concept of subnet management goes away in V6. You know, we've all spent probably lots of times, operational time, figuring out the right subnet or growing them or shrinking them depending on where they are. That whole concept just goes away when you just put 64s on all your interfaces. And so that's just a workload that we don't have anymore, and thank goodness.
We've got a couple minutes left. If you want to take any audience questions, more than happy to have a couple. Mr. Schiller?
Jason Schiller, Google, ASOAC. Can each of you talk about the reasons why you decided not to simply just keep buying IPv4 addresses or embrace carrier-grade NAT?
As a smaller organization, it didn't really seem to be like the way to go, I would say. But I think it's just that it's inherently unscalable if you look at the number of devices that exist today and where the trend line is going. And the number of silicon devices produced every year is some crazy number in the billions. And if all of those things need to be addressed, then there's no way we can scale with only 4 billion addresses.
For Comcast, the decision was a lot easier in the sense that it just wasn't economical. I mean, when you look at how many devices we would like to provision, continuing to try and buy IP addresses and propagate that model and the amount of money that it would require is actually, it's cheaper to deploy V6.
We had a similar experience at TWC. We have checked and evaluated CGN in the lab. We have it there as a, I guess you could call it a safety net, but boy, is it an expensive safety net. I don't think that any business plan that involves carrier-grade NAT is actually going to see the light of day and make it past the money people. It is simply too expensive.
CGNAT's a non-starter for us because we're on the content side of things, and CGNAT doesn't really do anything useful there. In terms of buying IP addresses as a strategy versus going to V6, well, in our case, that's a false dichotomy. We're probably going to end up buying IP addresses at some point in the near future. We haven't had to buy any yet, but we're definitely scraping the bottom of the barrel in terms of what we can internally recycle and what we can get from providers.
Stop. Do not give information about individual companies' thoughts.
Microphone?
I think that was a comment from legal suggesting we move the conversation along.
Got it.
Charles, did you have a comment on that?
Sure.
Anyway, well, let me wrap up
Oh,
without the
Go ahead.
specifics. The bottom line is we're going to have to do both, and there's other solutions available too.
As a cloud services provider, we are the target for a lot of workloads. So a majority of our connectivity comes in through direct connects or private connectivity from the individual enterprise. So egress connectivity requirements are less. Although we still do buy V4 address space, it's only because we have to meet the requirements of the customer on the other side, and a majority of that IP space is used as IPsec or VXLAN target addresses. So everything else would be an overlay on top of it at the customer's architecture.
Thanks. Donnie, you have a question, or are you just standing up?
No, I just had a quick comment. There was a question earlier that was posed, what do you do with your old equipment? Oh, it's Donnie Roisman with SoftLayer, sorry. A question was posed, what do you do with old equipment? I didn't hear anybody mention it, but I think a word of caution, I don't think it makes sense to take old IPv4 only equipment and ship it out to less developed areas, because then they're just going to run into this problem in some number of years, and it's going to be even more painful for them. So I would encourage anybody who is in a less developed area not to seek out older equipment which is not V6 compatible, and they really want to start moving with the most current capabilities so they can make sure that they can stay connected to the rest of the modern internet.
Just following up on that, as someone who ships equipment to developing countries regularly, the cost of shipping old equipment around the world far exceeds the value of the equipment. People in the developing world typically want things that are small and fast and new because the shipping cost makes much more difference than the difference between old and new equipment cost.
Yeah, great point. Okay, so we've got just a couple minutes left, so each of you can give any last comments you have, and we'll close this up.
I think for those who haven't started on the V6 road, it's time to start. And I think people in various aspects just have not been able to get their mind around the fact that the network underlying is changing, and it's really hard when you don't see that for so many years, right? My mom and dad understand what I do here, but don't necessarily know the details underneath that. And having to explain it to them and having them work through it is kind of interesting, but at the same time that has to happen in every organization. And the level, the knowledge level between V4 and V6 is still significant, but the gap is closing, and I think that is very significant and definitely very positive for the future, I think, of the V6 network.
I would probably echo that and just continue with, there's been a bit of a complacency that's developed over the years as we've had these conversations, and this transition has stretched on as long as it has, and we've been dealing with IPv4 depletion. And it's a little risky in the sense that, you know, a lot of people have gotten some bad information thinking, oh, this may be another, 10 years before we have to do anything, or we don't have to worry about it, right now. And I think for a lot of people, this transition is going to sneak up on them a lot faster than they expected. Given the rate of change that's going on in the internet right now, V6 is going to, come on pretty quickly, and hopefully it doesn't catch too many people off guard.
There have been two recurring themes in my conversations with people, both inside my day job and outside. With a lot of people come to me as, you're on the ARIN Advisory Council, can you give me some advice on this V6 thing? The first is there's a difference between conservation and just not wasting. And the conservation mandate for V4 is dead when you're talking about V6. We want to optimize for brain cells, not for address utilization. Any kind of variable according to need subnetting plan or anything like that is simply wasted time. It's a bad idea, and you'll regret it later once you understand how it all works. So the notion of trying to save space is simply a poor one. And this dovetails with the advice that I've given to folks who are coming to ARIN, which, to get an additional or an initial allocation of space, which is, how big is your service provider really? That /32 is the default allocation. It is not the only allocation. You almost certainly can justify more space than this /32 if you're not a trivially small size organization. What's the worst they can do? They can say no, draw up your hopes and dreams and ask for it. You'll probably get it. And that's been just such a hard thing for folks to wrap their heads around.
Yeah, I'm going to echo what Rob said. I used to work for an internet service provider not a residential provider, but a backbone provider. And during my time there, they managed to pretty well run out of their /32, and we went back to ARIN and got a 24. So it's not hard to get the space you need in V6. It's very, very easy. We've modified the policy several years back such that you can do some quick back of the envelope calculations relatively quickly and easily, and come up with a subnet size or a prefix size that is fairly generous in nature, and hand that to ARIN and say, we want this. And if you give them a copy of your back of the envelope calculations and they look at all sane, you're pretty much going to get it. So it's really, really simple. And that will save you a lot of headaches going forward if you get the right size block instead of trying to figure out how to compress everything into a /32. It's just not a good idea.
Unlike a lot of the other panelists, I've been in an environment dealing predominantly with enterprise and no residential users. So I kind of face a lot of the problems that the service providers faced 10 years ago with getting vendor support, although it's internally within the company, where I need customer demand to help solidify the entire stack. Because from an engineering perspective, we're able to tackle one application or one abstraction layer, but not all of them without a complete solution. So if you do know any enterprise customers that want to help push for a complete stack for solutions all the way through with V6, that would definitely help because it's kind of a catch-22 like we were a number of years ago when I was on the residential side. So just bringing it full circle, is the residential seems to be really pushing forward. The enterprise are very happy staying where they are until things start breaking. And they are happy to claim that nothing's broken because they still can't do certain aspects of V6.
Yeah, certainly understandable. The enterprise demand is going to trail the network side. But I really liked hearing all of these experiences, and I want to just thank everybody for their knowledge, their time, and sharing the experiences here at this meeting. Thanks very much, guys.